I'd like to call to order the joint meeting of the Glendale Council and the Glendale Housing Authority for November 19th, 2013 at 3:42 p.m. May we have a roll call for the council?
Council members: Friedman.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Sinanian.
Here.
Mayor Weaver.
Here. And for the Housing Authority?
Authority members: Friedman.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Razian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chair Sinanian.
Here.
May we have your report?
Agenda for the November 19, 2013 joint public meeting of the City Council and the Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, November 14, 2013 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you. What's next?
Item 1 is Director of Community Services and Parks regarding status of program planning for fiscal year 2014-2015, CDBG, ESG, and Home Annual Action Plan. 1A is council motion approving fiscal year 2014-2015 CDBG program priorities, a proposed CDBG funding allocation plan by funding category, and issuance of an RFP to the community and city departments for social services and capital improvements project. 1B is authority motion approving fiscal year 2014-2015 CDBG priorities, a proposed CDBG funding allocation plan by funding category, and issuance of an RFP to the community and city departments for social service and capital improvement projects.
And Mr. Ochoa, this is the beginning of the program, the priorities, and set the committee to work with Mr. Oliveris out there.
Yes, sir. Where we are absorbing another $300,000 reduction in the coming years allocation from the federal government. The CDBG committee is prepared to do its customary, very conscientious job of wading through proposals. So if you have any specific questions, Mr. Duran can answer those for you.
Mr. Duran.
Yes, Mayor Weaver, members of the City Council, Chairman Sinanian, members of the Housing Authority. As Mr. Ochoa indicated, and as you've alluded to, Mayor, this is the initial stage of the program planning for the Community Development Block Grant Program for fiscal year 14-15. We've been through this before several times. This is actually the 40th year of the Community Development Block Grant Program, so it is one of the oldest federal human service programs. The Community Development Block Grant Program is part of the 5-year consolidated plan, which was submitted to HUD in 2010, and which also includes housing and homeless needs assessments and funding strategies, as well as community development. But for program purposes, we always focus on the CDBG part of the 5-year plan because it's the program with the most discretion and the most participation by the community. As everyone is aware, everyone in this country, we continue to see reductions in funding from the federal government, and our programs here in Glendale are no exception. For fiscal year 2014-15, we are projecting a CDBG entitlement amount of $1.7 million, which does represent a 6.3% decrease. And then we're recommending adding $60,000 in reprogrammed funds and another $58,000 in program income for a total amount of funds available for fiscal year 14-15 of $1,818,000. And this is a $210,000 decrease from our current funds available in fiscal year 13-14, which was $2,028,000. The new CDBG Advisory Committee, with 3 new members, has met 4 times already since they were all appointed in June, so they are working feverishly already. They are under the leadership of Efrain Olivares, who was elected the chair, and Ramela Markarian, who was elected the vice chair. They are working very well together. They have received presentations from all of the current CDBG recipients, the organizations, to learn more about their operations. And they are each making their individual drop-in visits as they have time to each of the agencies. So they're taking their job very, very seriously. So the committee, which is appointed by City Council, has reviewed and approved the proposed funding allocation plan by funding category. They've approved and are recommending the program priorities and the issuance of the RFP, which are now before the City Council and the Housing Authority. Funding plan includes the funding plan that's being recommended, which is in one of your exhibits, includes $340,000 for planning and program management and oversight, which also pays for planning and oversight of all of our homeless programs. And this compares to $362,000, which was available last year, so that's a reduction of $22,000. The plan also includes an allocation of $263,000 for social services, and again, that compares to $272,000, which was available last year, or a reduction of $9,000. The proposed plan also includes a recommendation for $1,185,000 for capital improvement projects, again, compared to $1.4 million, which was available last year. The capital improvement projects do include the pre-designation of 3 city projects that fall in the capital improvement category, and those projects include the Southern Glendale Code Enforcement Program, which is being recommended at $376,000, which would be a 10% reduction from the current year. The other pre-designated project is our Section 108 loan payment to HUD, which is for the Essentia project, and that's $206,000. Then the third project represents the second increment of funding for the Palmer Park Improvement Project in order to be able to complete that project. And that funding amount is $303,000, and again, that compares with last year's allocation of $499,000. So all of the pre-designated city projects took a reduction, and the proposed allocations for the community projects or the undesignated projects is $300,000, which is the same amount as the current year, and the committee felt strongly that that funding amount should not be reduced, and the maximum be made available to the community, so the plan reflects that direction. Subject to the Council's approval of the proposed funding allocation plan by funding category, we are set to publish the request for proposal in a newspaper this Friday to hold a technical assistance workshop the following week. The deadline for proposals will be December 30th. The advisory committee will be receiving the proposal packets in early February, and they will begin their proposal evaluations and interviews with the agencies in February and March. They will develop their preliminary funding recommendations. We will hold a public hearing. Then those funding recommendations will be submitted to the City Council and the Housing Authority for final review and approval, and that'll be probably sometime in late April. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Mr. Olivares, the chair of the committee, is here in the audience if you have any questions for him. Other than that, other than the reduction, it's a pretty standard funding allocation plan. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of leeway. HUD mandates the maximum we can spend on public social services at 15%, and the amount that we're able to spend on project management and oversight at 20%. Everything else goes to capital projects.
What did you say the total for this year is?
I'm sorry, Mayor?
The total amount for the program?
1.8.
Do anybody remember what it was like 5 years ago?
It was close to $4 million.
That's what I mean. Cutting so much, it's hurting so much. We have less and less wiggle room as the federal government appears to be eliminating the program over time.
Every year we go through that. It's less and
Imagine
less and
5
less.
years ago was,
And the costs keep going up the other way for...
I know, it's,
I had a question on pre-designated projects under the loan, the Section 108 loan. It's always been at $198,964, and it went up, not a lot, but it went up a little. Did interest go up? That's what was my curious...
Yes, as a third member, Mincy, our payments are prescribed to us by HUD. HUD has a 10-year payment plan, and based on the prevailing interest rate in any given year, our payment may slightly go up or slightly come down.
I see.
Evidently, it's slightly increased from last year. But this is the second year of a 10-year repayment for the $2 million we borrowed from HUD in order to complete the Essentia Emergency Shelter and Access Center project.
Yes.
I have a question. May we know the total number of Glendale's homeless population? And did the number grow compared to last year's?
Yeah, based on last year's count, I think we were up to 320, Moises? 320, which is about a 30 or 40 number increase from the previous year, but mainly because of the winter shelter program. Last year we had a larger winter shelter program than we did the year before, so we counted more people. This year we're not going to do a count. HUD requires us to do a count at a minimum every 2 years, so this year we're going to forego a count. Our homeless coordinator's on maternity leave, so she's not available to oversee that. But we're also going to have an 80-bed winter shelter program this year, so those numbers will be counted as part of the sheltered count in Glendale.
Thank you.
Mr. Sinanian.
Mr. Duran, the code enforcement funds, and every year that I've been on CDBG, I've asked the question about this. Correct me if I'm wrong. The explanation for why code enforcement is being paid out of CDBG funding is that it's in South Glendale and somehow fits the scope of how CDBG funds should be spent, or can be spent, rather. Is that correct?
Correct. It's part of the city's overall neighborhood revitalization strategy, which is HUD expects us in our 5-year plan to have a revitalization strategy. So code enforcement is a key component of meeting that requirement.
And given this, I guess the question is more to Mr. Ochoa than to Mr. Duran. Given the fact that these funds are dwindling at an alarming rate, where these applicants are finding it harder and harder effectuating meaningful programs because our allocations to them are becoming smaller and smaller. Since code enforcement is not doing in South Glendale anything different that they're doing in North Glendale, can't we find the $376,000 funding from another source so that this money goes to our community groups as part of the CIP portion of CDBG funds?
Councilman Sinanian, Chair Sinanian, at this point, no, we really cannot get ongoing funding. One-time funding, certainly. Ongoing funding, we do not have that in the current budget or have that identified. Now, later on tonight, we're asking for items that might allow us to bring more resources to the general fund. And at that point, it is quite possible and maybe even likely that, just like the rest of the Community Development Department for the most part, code enforcement would migrate into the general fund. This portion of code enforcement would migrate into the general fund and free up CDBG dollars for other items that you might determine more appropriate to the CDBG mission.
But from time to time, we have money become available. Sometimes it's unexpected, and we have nice surprises happen sometimes. So all I would hope for that we keep an open eye and consider, even if it's one time, that one time is going to make a huge difference to some community group that provides services to children or the elderly and gets funded through our CDBG funds. I just hope that we can keep in mind that when money does become available, that this is a good thing to fund code enforcement, since again they don't do anything in South Glendale, they don't do in North Glendale, and we fund the North Glendale code enforcement from what, the general fund?
At this point, yeah.
So that's my argument. That way, again, $376,000 additional dollars, which would be over 100% increase for the CIP portion of CDBG funds. I mean, that's huge.
Well, the pre-designated, when the park is done, that money that's in for the parks will be available for other uses, correct?
But we always have
Right.
another park take its place. It's never
Only by our vote.
Presuming that the funding level remains static.
Ms.
So
Craig,
I have two questions. The first is just I'm curious about something Mr. Sinanian just said about the split between North and South Glendale. Do we spend the same amount of money in North Glendale on code enforcement as we do in South Glendale?
You know, I don't know. Based on, I don't think Mr. Agani is in the chambers at this point. We do have actually a very small number of code enforcement officers to the extent that code enforcement revolves, in this case, revolves around more cramped conditions in overcrowded areas. It's going to be a higher focus in South Glendale than North Glendale, generally speaking. So my sense is that we don't spend as much proportionately in other areas of the city because the area of focus is in this census tract, and that's really what binds the CDBG funding to it.
Well, the next time we discuss this code enforcement issue, that might be good information to have, because if it's sort of equitable by proportion, then I think Mr. Sinanian has a point. But if it's not, then if a larger proportion is going to the area that we see that we have this need in South Glendale, then I think that's a different question. But my other question is, because this comes up a lot from the nonprofits, where if money goes into something that's seen as a city function, like code enforcement, as opposed to going to a community group, that somehow the money's been mismanaged. So my question is, were CDBG block grants, were they intended to be simply pass-throughs to community groups and nonprofits? Are we doing something wrong by putting some of that money into programs that are run by the city?
No, I think when you look at overall, from entitlement cities like Glendale to participating cities that are much smaller, that are governed by the County Community Development Commission, the use of CDBG dollars for code enforcement and other neighborhood preservation programs is something entirely within the flavor of and mission and scope of CDBG.
Because it would seem pretty inefficient to me if it was set up to just be pass-throughs. If the money was supposed to go to us just so we could hand it out, that would be, I mean, I could see the government doing that, but I don't think that's what was intended. I mean, in my view, the nonprofits really are our partners. And to the extent that we can utilize their volunteers and their fundraising to service the community, that's money, CDBG pass-through money that's very well spent. On the other hand, there are things they can't do, like code enforcement. I mean, they're not set up to do that, and they benefit the community just as much. So to me, the issue is not so much whether a community group needs the money. Of course they need the money. They all need the money. The question is, how can we best spend this money to best service the community? That's all I'm interested in. To me, it doesn't matter whether the city's doing it or a nonprofit is doing it. It's who can do the job the best. And some of these jobs cannot be done by community groups. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be spending the money or spending resources or CDBG money, because that's what the program was intended to do. It was never set up to be a pass-through to nonprofits. It was set up to benefit parts of the community that need the money. And I know that code enforcement, particularly for people who live in apartments and who complain to us on a daily basis about smoking violations and tenant landlord issues and overcrowding and all those things, that I think they're very well benefited by code enforcement. Now, as times are good and we have more money, absolutely, I would love to free some of those funds up and have them go to the community groups. I think that right now we're just not in that place, and hopefully in the future we will be. I'd love to see more code enforcement officers. I mean, just to give you an example, it used to be that things that were, just sort of small quality of life issues were noticed by our code enforcement employees. And now I think we're pretty much completely complaint-driven. I was going to tell you that on Brandon Central there are these pink signs advertising some business that have been just spreading like weeds. In the past, I would just know that someone would drive by and get rid of them. Now I have to, complain. So I'd love to see us beef that up as we have more funds.
Just a quick note on the issue of whether more money is being spent on code enforcement in South Glendale rather than North Glendale. There are many services provided by the city that are disproportionate in one part of the city or the other, and funding comes from the general fund. We don't differentiate between, are we spending more on North Glendale, so therefore we should go to CDBG. The point is, if we're spending on code enforcement, the point I'm trying to make, if we're spending on code enforcement in one part of the city out of the general fund, logic dictates that we should spend on that for that same purpose in another part of the city from the general fund. That way we free up the money for the other, for community groups. In terms of whether, CDBG is a pass-through, I don't think it's ever been a pass-through, nor is it a pass-through now. We administer those funds. I mean, we are on top of it. This department does a stellar job of monitoring every aspect of how this money is spent. And that's a huge role that the city plays in connection with the CDBG funds. So in that sense, it's not merely a pass-through. So then again, the point becomes, well, if we have the city do all these great things, we have a parks department. We have money that's being spent on parks, but nevertheless, we spend money from CDBG funds on parks. Don't get me wrong, it's great. It does better the community. It does provide park space for residents in South Glendale who so badly need it. But we also have the parks department that has funding sources from other places. It would be nice if the funding didn't come specifically from CDBG sources so that those other community groups could use this money to implement their project. I mean, it's not, the reality of it is that there's not enough money. I mean, we all know that. So therefore, we're using this money. But to the extent that there is other money that could be spent for code enforcement, that would be nice. That's all I'm saying.
Mr. Duran, would you repeat what you said about what the federal government demands we do with CDBG money? We have to have a program, right? We have to be spending like in code enforcement, those are requirements?
CDBG funds are designed, their purpose is to serve low and moderate income families, low and moderate income neighborhoods. In neighborhoods that have concentrations of low-income housing or substandard housing. In Glendale, most of our multifamily, low-income, substandard housing is concentrated in southern Glendale, south of Broadway. The CDBG funds allow us to concentrate CDBG funds to those low-income neighborhoods, to work with the landlords to provide a safe, decent, and affordable housing in southern Glendale. So CDBG funds are a good fit for a code enforcement program in a low-income neighborhood if you want to concentrate upgrading substandard housing. Most cities do use CDBG funds for code enforcement in their respective low-income neighborhoods, so it is a common use of CDBG funds. And in our 5-year consolidated plan that we submit to HUD, we do have to articulate how we revitalize our low-income neighborhoods, and so code enforcement obviously is an integral part of that as a resource.
I thought you can't turn your back on it, in other words, but we won't have a program at all. Okay, is there any more questions, or where's our motion of 1A for the council?
I will move 1A.
I'll second it.
Roll call.
Council members: Friedman,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Sinanian,
Yes.
Mayor Weaver.
Aye.
For housing, 1B,
Second.
Roll call.
Authority members: Friedman,
Yes.
Vinci,
yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Brazzian,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Weaver,
Aye.
Chair Sinanian.
Yes.
Good luck out there. Everyone, good luck. Is there a motion to adjourn for city council?
So moved.
Stand
For housing?
adjourned for housing?
So moved.
Second?
Okay, stand adjourned at 4:05 PM.